Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's October 18th, 2025. We'll start with a very aggressive string of messages from the Department of Homeland Security sent out earlier this week. The United States has no obligation to host foreigners who wish death on Americans. The State Department continues to identify visa holders who celebrated the heinous assassination of Charlie Kirk. Here are just a few examples of aliens who are no longer welcome in the U.S. An Argentine national said that Kirk, quote, devoted his entire life spreading racist, xenophobic, misogynistic rhetoric, unquote, and deserves to burn in hell. Visa revoked. A South African national mocked Americans grieving the loss of Kirk, saying, quote, they're hurt that their racist rally ended in an attempted martyrdom, unquote, and alleging, quote, he was used to AstroTurf, a movement of white nationalist trailer trash, unquote. Visa revoked. A Mexican national said that Kirk died being a racist. He died being a misogynist, and stated that there are people who deserve to die. There are people who would make the world better off dead. Visa revoked. And it goes on and on like this with instances of people who posted things in social media, and DHS ferreted out who they were and took advantage of the legal discretion to revoke visas that federal immigration law permits and revoked the permits of, or the visas of, these people. And this is exactly what I was hoping to see from the Trump administration in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, that I have to say I was more black-pilled than maybe I should have been, and this could end up being limited and primarily for show, but it certainly seems like quite a good start to weaponize the justice system to punish enemies and reward friends. And in a happy update to a grisly topic that we discussed last week, Ron DeSantis, the man who butchered a 6-year-old and tried to kill the rest of the 6-year-old's family in Kentucky and was let off after just 7 years of incarceration, upon being freed, relocated to Florida. And the state of Florida immediately came up with a pretense to arrest DeSantis on a violation of some sort of formulaic relocation law that presumably, if it happened to most people, might result in a fine or even just a warning. But the Attorney General of the state of Florida presumably put people on the case with the instruction to find something. Here's the man, now find the crime. And that is exactly what they did. And now he is behind bars, and there were probably a lot of charges that they'll be able to pile up on him for other instances of things, maybe things that are still within the statute of limitations that go back to before he was incarcerated for the murder in Kentucky. And I think this is exactly what the right needs to do. This is the beginnings of the Red Caesar moment that is going to be required if anything about the MAGA movement is going to be sustained going into the future. Because without question, irrespective of what the Trump administration does now, what they've done in these first 9 months, or what they do in the remaining 3+ years of the second Trump administration, the weaponization of the Justice Department to go after people on the right, the maggots as they refer to them as, is going to be guaranteed to come back in full force in 2028 if the Trump administration isn't succeeded by a MAGA Republican.
In order to reward friends and punish enemies, it is useful to have a catalyzing event. For the left, a few years ago in 2021, it was January 6th, the riot at the U.S. Capitol, which was used as a pretext for the left to go after MAGA-affiliated people. And that's been shown all the way from just common proles who got a little too eager on January 6th and let the exuberance of the moment take over their better judgment. Those people were thrown in dungeons, subjected to solitary confinement, and essentially way over prosecuted, overcharged, and over-sentenced. And that was many knock-on effects from that to surveil even just recently was revealed that the Biden administration, Jack Smith, as the special prosecutor in the course of his investigation into January 6th, had subpoenaed phone records of several Republican senators during and around the time of January 6, 2021. So in many ways, that was used as a catalyst for the left, or broadly defined, to go after the right. I would argue more recently for the right, it was the assassination of Charlie Kirk. That was the pretext for doing things that many, I believe, in the Trump administration were ready and wanting to do, people like Stephen Miller especially. That was the green light that they needed to do those things. That, like Ness mentioned, revoking visas of foreigners who were talking trash about Charlie Kirk. It's again the idea of Saul Alinsky, and more recently expressed by Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. And while Trump appears to certainly be using the Department of Justice to punish his enemies, he's not limiting it to that executive branch agency. He is also seeking to weaponize the Internal Revenue Service, pulling from a Wall Street Journal article dated October 15th, titled "Trump Team Plans IRS Overhaul to Enable Pursuit of Left-Leaning Groups." Quoting from the article, the Trump administration is preparing sweeping changes at the Internal Revenue Service that would allow the agency to pursue criminal inquiries of left-leaning groups more easily. A senior IRS official involved in the effort has drawn up a list of potential targets that includes major Democratic donors. The undertaking aims to install allies of President Trump at the IRS Criminal Investigative Division, or IRS/CI, to exert firmer control over the unit and weaken the involvement of IRS lawyers in criminal investigations. And there's some obvious names and organizations on this enemies list. At the top is predictably George Soros and his Open Society Foundation, which is behind, among many things, perhaps most notably, most successfully, in getting involved in various local district attorney elections in jurisdictions such as San Francisco, Los Angeles, and I believe New York City and Philadelphia, I believe, essentially getting progressive prosecutors into those offices. They found that it's a lot easier to get prosecutors, well, ostensibly prosecutors, but in reality, they just won't enforce the law. That's a lot easier to do than getting the criminal laws changed, and in some cases, implementing bail reform. If you have a prosecutor who's not going to bring criminal charges, that basically accomplishes the goal of alleviating mass incarceration.
But even those Soros-funded DAs are not implementing some principle of antagonism towards the incarceral state for all people at all times. Alvin Bragg famously is a George Soros money guy, and he tried to put Daniel Penny away for life for enforcing the laws in New York City that Alvin Bragg does everything he can to keep from being enforced against his favored groups. And as sure as I stand here, there is Soros money behind both the January 6th riots at the Capitol and a lot of Soros laundered money that was funding the activities during the Summer of Love in 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd death. It's been reported that there were hundreds of FBI agents agitating in the crowd at January 6th. The putative reason that the Biden weaponized Department of Justice will use is that they were there to keep things from getting out of control, but that is, like so much else, a total inversion of what they were actually doing, which was ensuring that the embers were fed continuously so that they would be able to prod more people to take more actions. That's, I think, Ray Epps shouting to a bunch of members of the protest that we have to go in there, we have to go in tomorrow, we have to go to the Capitol, we have to go in. And I would imagine that if you had full unfettered access to all the information at the NSA and the other alphabet intelligence agencies, that there is a network thicker than Charlotte's Web between members of said intelligence agencies and the FBI and people who are receiving money from the Open Society Foundation.
So if it is the case that January 6th was essentially a false flag operation and that it was instigated directly by a combination of people on the inside, so FBI agents, and then people on the outside, people affiliated either directly or indirectly with George Soros and the Open Society Foundation, if all that is true, presumably, or if possibly, this weaponization, if we want to call it, of the IRS will be able to look into this matter and see if there's any concrete evidence of that. So further on that point, quoting again from the Wall Street Journal article, quote, Trump has ordered Bessent, that's Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Trump has ordered Bessent as the acting IRS commissioner to refer certain tax-exempt organizations to the Justice Department for further investigation. Bessent has also been directed to use the Treasury's Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Office to examine groups' financial flows and try to trace any illicit funding streams. And this weaponization of the IRS brings to my mind, at least, the incident during the Obama years in which the IRS used inappropriate criteria to select conservative groups for what proved to be lengthy, invasive scrutiny when seeking tax-exempt status.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that this is ground that was trod by Lois Lerner and the IRS during the Obama administration over a decade ago. There isn't anything new here other than it is a Republican administration utilizing tools that the managerial state has been happy to use for generations. And if it seems shocking at first to imagine that the Open Society would be engaging in domestic political protests, this is what happened on January 6th, and what happened in 2020 is quite similar to color revolutions that the U.S. government and the managerial state of which NGOs like the Open Society Foundation are intricately involved. These are things that the American empire and the deep state have done in several places all over the world, in Georgia and in Ukraine and Iran and Venezuela, Malaysia, Hong Kong. The list goes on and on of countries where NGO money and USAID money, and those two things, there is a lot of fungibility between those two categories. That funding like this goes into blow up the seeming importance and popularity of oppositional figures that serve as a way of trying to undermine the regimes in power that the American empire disapproves of. And as Heritage America and Americans have become the new barbarians, it should come as little surprise that these color revolutions designed to topple regimes the American empire disapproves of which the first Trump administration certainly could lay claim to, that these revolutions have made their way home.
And I think some of these similar tactics were used against the radical left wing during the 1960s by the more reactionary, conservative FBI domestic intelligence agencies. And then Trump is certainly, he's, again, using a very flimsy pretext against Venezuela, accusing them of drug trafficking into the United States when it seems pretty clear that the fentanyl and the most harmful drugs that are entering the United States do not originate from Venezuela. Nevertheless, Trump is working backwards from whatever motivation exactly he has for overthrowing the Maduro regime in Venezuela. That's the outcome he wants, and he's working backwards and coming up with whatever pretext he thinks is necessary. And it doesn't even when Pam Bondi was testifying, I think last week, and she was very flippant and just refused to answer basic questions about the legal justification for the attack on the Venezuelan ships in the Caribbean. So just in the past few weeks, there's been several more examples of this principle that Trump seems to be following of punishing his enemies and rewarding his friends. Punishing enemies, James Comey, the former FBI director, has been recently indicted. And in that case, Trump wasn't even being at all subtle about it. He issued a public statement, I believe a Truth Social post, demanding that the Attorney General Pam Bondi bring charges against Comey. The statute of limitations was days away from expiring, and Trump directly intervened and removed somebody ostensibly who was a Trump loyalist who refused to bring charges against Comey because apparently in his professional legal opinion the charges were not warranted. Trump intervened, kicked him out, and installed a more pliable prosecutor who brought the charges against Comey. And then we have Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, was indicted with mortgage fraud claims, something that I certainly don't know the specifics of, but it seems like something that happens all the time, and that 9 times out of 10 is not prosecuted. And if it is prosecuted, the violator gets a slap on the wrist. In this case, it appears like Trump is doing what he can to throw the book at Letitia James. And same thing to Adam Schiff, the senator from California. A similar, he was indicted on a similar mortgage fraud claim. And then perhaps most seriously and most actually legitimately against John Bolton. The details of that case, the indictment was unsealed recently, and it's quite astonishing reading the details, assuming that all the facts alleged or the allegations are true. It's astonishing that somebody in John Bolton's high level, working in the high levels of the government during the Bush administrations and then as Trump's national security advisor in Trump's first term, somebody of his stature would do something so careless as what he's supposedly did, which was send diary entries on a group text to his wife and daughter talking about classified information that he gained in an unsecured messaging system. I think he used AOL. And then apparently there was a hack of that messaging system by Iran, supposedly in 2021. And during the course of that investigation, John Bolton was not forthcoming about what exactly had been hacked. And so that one, it sounds like the investigation apparently begun under the Biden administration, and the Trump administration just picked off where the Biden administration left off. So that one actually seems not necessarily politically motivated. There's not as obvious evidence that Trump is just weaponizing the Justice Department.
I am more jaded than Jeff. I don't find it particularly surprising. John Bolton presumed that as a friend of the deep state that he was under no threat for the egregious violations of the vaunted national security that he was involved in. This is not much different than what Hillary Clinton did 15 years ago by taking classified documents when she was Secretary of State and storing them on commercial email accounts. Gmail is the one that she used in particular. And while it caused her some embarrassment in the 2016 Democratic primaries, she was never punished in any way for it. And she was Secretary of State, which is an even more prestigious and important position than National Security Advisor. And as someone who had turned on the MAGA movement and was able to play the role of the conservative, the lifelong Republican who was so flabbergasted and scandalized by what the Trump administration had done, he was particularly useful to the American empire and to the managerial state. John Bolton was, and so he presumed that he could be sloppy and that there would be no consequences for it. And after the first Trump administration, it's difficult to blame him. The reporting that the Biden administration was involved in investigations of John Bolton are what they are, but we don't know. It's a counterfactual as to whether or not a Kamala Harris administration would have used that publicly. I think that's highly unlikely. I think they would have had the information, but I do not think they would have prosecuted John Bolton. I suspect the intelligence agencies have a lot of dirt on a lot of people that they are able to deploy with their discretion when the situation suits them, but for the vast majority of cases, that simply remains in the blackmail file.
So you're drawing a clear line between Trump 45 and Trump 47 regarding this principle of punishing enemies and rewarding friends. The Trump 45 not following that principle and Trump 47 seemingly following it. It's interesting to think, given the chance during 2016 of lock her up, that was a go-to, one of Trump's greatest hits during his campaign rallies. He loved hearing the crowd talk about locking her up. It's interesting to think if that had been his running mate in 2024 and he had won, if he actually would have sought to lock Hillary Clinton up. He doesn't seem to have any interest in going after the Clintons. I never sensed any real animosity that Trump had towards the Clintons.
Well, he wouldn't be likely to have a lot of animosity to Hillary Clinton because it's a pretty open secret that she wanted him to rise to the top of the Republican field. They had a long relationship, in particular Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, with Bill Clinton having a membership at Trump's golf club and going to Chelsea Clinton's wedding. To a significant extent, it was Hillary Clinton that helped Donald Trump become president by not only encouraging the corporate media to give him a lot of publicity and free airtime under the errant assumption that he would be the easiest one for Hillary Clinton to beat in the 2016 general election, but also providing in Hillary Clinton one of the least likable, least charismatic Democratic candidates potentially in all of American history, such that someone who was so reviled by so much of the establishment in 2016 was still able to win against all odds. And against any other candidate, it is unlikely that Donald Trump would have been able to pull off the victory in 2016. And so I think there are a plethora of reasons that Trump does not have the same level of animosity towards the Clintons that he does towards Comey or Clapper or John Bolton. And while I don't think that Trump has his heart in toppling regimes in Latin America or the color revolution push more generally, not only because it was used against him, but I think at a very visceral level, he wants to make deals and do business with every country on the planet. And so the Venezuelan action is an example, I think, of rewarding his friends, in this case, Marco Rubio, who is a member of good standing with the deep state. And to rehash what we talked about in the 2024 presidential election with the insurgency of elites, for the second Trump administration to be able to execute the rewarding of friends and punishing of enemies, distinct from the failures of the first Trump administration, it required some buy-in from the disaffected members of the elites and the managerial state to get behind the MAGA movement. And so by creating an alliance of Silicon Valley venture capitalists and Israel firsters and Latin American regime change advocates, Trump was able to, in his second administration, bring together enough factions of the elite of the managerial state who were ensconced in the American empire to allow him to change directions without having to try to burn the entire thing down and build it up from scratch, which is something he would have, I think, been incapable of doing. To the extent that he was serious about anything in his first administration, he was utterly inept in just about everything that he tried to do. And it's much different in the second administration, even though not everything is what the America First MAGA crowd wanted. They are getting some of the things they wanted. And the compromise is that some of the neo-connery and some of the American empire world building is being allowed to continue, but it's being much reduced in scale, and it's being permitted as special favors to those elites who came over to Trump's side. The pet projects that they are interested in, they are being given a free hand to make those things happen. I think in the case of Venezuela, that is very clearly being driven by Marco Rubio and factions that support him.
We've spoken about the enemies that Trump has punished. He's also been rewarding some friends. At the beginning of the term, of course, there was the blanket pardons for all the J6 people. That is the J6 rioters. Also at the beginning of the term, Trump pardoned Ross Ulbricht, the founder of Silk Road, who was serving out a long prison sentence. And then just this week, Trump pardoned George Santos. So I'm pulling from a New York Times article. Former Representative George Santos of New York, the disgraced Republican fabulist whose lies made him an object of national scorn, was released from a federal prison on Friday night after President Trump commuted his 7-year sentence for fraud. The story of George Santos is a quite ridiculous one. He claimed that he was descended from Holocaust refugees, and his mother, he said, had been in the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. He claimed to be a college volleyball star, and he boasted of extensive Wall Street experience that allowed him to report loaning his campaign hundreds of thousands of dollars, but none of this was true. And Santos won his seat in Long Island, New York in 2022, and he was young, he was a Brazilian American, he was homosexual, and it seemed to perhaps indicate an opening up of the GOP's tent, making it more of a big tent party. Then Congress did an ethics investigation and found that Mr. Santos improperly spent campaign funds on Botox, designer fashion, cosmetics, and OnlyFans purchases. And then more than 100 Republicans joined Democrats to expel him from Congress in December 2023. And Santos was on Tucker Carlson's show a few months ago, and apparently he also has the support of Marjorie Taylor Greene, so that was enough to get Trump's attention. And I think this quote from Trump, a couple quotes from Trump sums up. Here's a quote from Trump. "He lied like hell," Mr. Trump said at the time, "and I didn't know him, but he was 100% for Trump." And so in Trump's calculation, it doesn't really matter what Santos did. He supported Trump, and therefore Trump supported him.
Yes, it's encouraging to see Trump be so explicit about it, because we have political prisoners here, or we had political prisoners by the hundreds, if not the thousands, after January 6th. When can you think in American history where people who participated in a political protest where no one was killed, at least no one died as a result of anything that the protesters did, who received sentences for 15, 20, 25 years in federal prison, often in solitary confinement, in abusive circumstances? That's a clear indication at a massive scale of an entire Justice Department bureaucratic apparatus being weaponized to indiscriminately punish by the hundreds people with no power whatsoever who simply engaged in a political protest where there were trespassing charges and some damage to property, and the people who are scandalized by Santos not having to spend the better part of the rest of his life in prison for fibbing, for telling tall tales while on the campaign trail. Those are the same people who are happy to see these hundreds and thousands of heritage American proles thrown into dungeons and have the keys thrown away forever. And so Trump finally beginning to realize what he's up against is something that Heritage America desperately needs to have happen, because the hour is very, very late in terms of the viability of the United States as currently constituted.
Another story that connects to this theme, maybe less obviously, is two stories that are somewhat related in theme. First is the recent leak of group text messages among young Republicans who were making off-color jokes, something that you'd probably see on 4chan, or these days you'd probably see it on Twitter and X. Holocaust jokes, jokes against black people, against women, just standard stuff that young white kids, Gen Z kids on the right make jokes about all the time. And those messages were leaked, and predictably there was much curl clutching and condemnation by GOP leaders in various states. I know Kansas, some of the Kansas Republican leaders threw them under the bus, the young Republicans involved in these text messages. And perhaps what's at least most notable to me about that story was J.D. Vance's reaction. He was very dismissive of it. He basically says, boys will be boys. This essentially treating it like as a learning opportunity that he would talk to his young boys about, maybe chastise them gently. If he found out that his sons had done something like this, he would have chastised them gently and said, I know you were just kidding, but this is not something you should do. Make a better decision going forward, and that's the end of it. That's essentially J.D. Vance's stance, and I think that's exactly the right approach, because I don't think anybody involved on any side of this, whether on the right or the left, I don't think anyone's actually offended. Now, the second story I alluded to that's related to this in terms of the subject matter is the text messages that were leaked recently from the black candidate for Attorney General of Virginia. The election is in a few weeks. His name is Jay Jones, and these text messages were leaked. He was talking about how he wants the children of his political opponents to be killed, and the person he was texting with was appalled by the messages and apparently called him and was concerned and said, Jay, what are you talking about?" And Jay Jones just doubled down on it. And the Democratic establishment seems to be closing ranks and is not throwing him under the bus. And so I think there's a dynamic here of punishing enemies and rewarding friends. There's both objectionable behavior, perhaps on both sides, although I would argue that the Jay Jones is messages are far more offensive than any off-color jokes that the young Republicans made. But putting that aside, it is a situation where both sides are supporting their side because that's their team.
I think this illustrates several things. One, that the J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller nexus of the second Trump administration is the natural successor to this aggressive, more assertive, reward friends and punish enemies iteration of the MAGA movement. And we see that it has far, far from being something that has been adopted by everyone with an R next to their name. As Jeff was describing, there are many establishment type Republicans who are safe pets of the managerial state, who are doing the song and dance that they are expected to do, clutching their pearls and condemning this rhetoric that is distasteful. I will nitpick a little bit. I don't know that I would necessarily disagree with Jeff's assessment that what the Attorney General candidate in Virginia said is far more egregious. It may be that it seemed more serious because he doubled down on it, but in the case of the leaked text messages, the interest of full disclosure, they were talking about throwing people in gas chambers. So that is, if taken literally, serious enough. I think it is obvious that these things were not meant to be literal, and this is the sort of standard internet banter that takes place on things like Telegram and 4chan. And in the case of Jay Jones, I suspect it was channeling a more deeply felt, visceral antagonism towards Heritage America. There's a lot of Bolshevik energy. What Jay Jones is saying there does not seem out of place from what the Bolsheviks in 1917 were saying about the Tsar's family before they lined all the children up against the wall and blew their brains out one by one, making each child watch siblings being killed and watching the wife of the Tsar have all of her children butchered in front of her before she was killed. And so it could be just a subjective assessment on my part that gives more the benefit of the doubt to kids talking presumably privately on a message board or on a chat stream that they don't expect to ever be made public, and someone who is an elected official talking to another elected official and feeling no embarrassment or need to retract anything that he has said even after he was called out on it. The fact that the entire Democratic establishment is standing behind him while just a faction of the MAGA movement is standing behind these young Republicans shows that the transformation of the Republican Party into something that already characterizes the Democratic Party is, while it has begun, it is a long way from being entirely completed. And if you're a prim and proper Republican who is uneasy about what these young Republicans are saying, fair enough, but please do not lend any moral credence to the people who are feigning outrage about this. These are the same people, the crossover, the overlap between the Republicans who are clutching their pearls over this and who have continued to vote to fund Ukraine to the tunes of tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. There's an enormous amount of overlap there. So the people who are upset about naughty words being exchanged between 20-somethings on a putatively private message board are the same people who are happy to support the slaughter of Slavs by the hundreds of thousands. And so, however uneasy you might be about the rhetoric, keep the moral universes separate, because what these people who pretend to be offended about naughty words. Speaking of the elite insurgency, the DOGE movement was unfortunately doomed from the beginning. It increasingly appears to be. From The Economist YouGov, a poll asking respondents if they support permanently laying off some number of federal workers during the government shutdown. Just 29% support the idea of laying off some limited number of them. And now we're weeks into this government shutdown and nobody has noticed anything change in their daily lives. And so it is quite apparent to anyone who wants to pay attention to it that these people are not critical, they're not imperative, they don't even do anything that anyone can notice, and yet still, for instinctive or ideological reasons, fewer than 1 in 3 Americans will even entertain the idea of laying off some portion of these people. Not all of the people who currently aren't working, but just some portion of them. And so the idea that there is some sort of populist support for draining the swamp in the way that it will have to be drained by going after the bureaucratic state, by cutting it out, just doesn't seem like it ever materializes whenever it is put to the opinion of the general public. It's something that's going to have to be done in opposition to American populism. It's, I guess, a more clear way to articulate this is that the populism defining the MAGA movement is distinctly devoid of any sort of libertarian impulse to cut down on the largesse, the spending of the bureaucratic state. It is, to the extent that there is energy to go after official Washington and the American empire, it is not to, again, drain the swamp. It is to throw out enemies and put in friends. And I suppose that dovetails well with the themes that we've been discussing up to this point. And then, apropos of not much of anything other than it was included in the same poll just referenced, the question put to respondents, quote, "Do you think that someone who is homosexual can change their sexual orientation if they choose to do so?" Unquote. Just 27% of respondents said yes, and only 24% of Democrats said yes. And so for fewer than 1 in 4 people on the left to say that sexual orientation is something that can shift or can be changed, or something that is not innate to a person, of course, obviously flies in the face of gender reassignment and gender fluidity and all of these things that have characterized the transgender movement, generally championed by the left over the last decade. When a man playing make-believe, pretending to be a woman, tries to take steps to surgically mutilate himself to become a woman, people on the right are understandably fond of criticizing him as being a man and being unable to change it. And the left, in contrast, criticizes that as being transphobic and being bigoted and all of these other things when it's applied to gender bending, but they will not apply the same standard to homosexuals. Here you're seeing that 3 in 4 self-described Democrats think that a gay person cannot change his sexual orientation. So they support a man changing his actual sex, but a man changing his sexual orientation is something that is impossible. So you can see the inherent contradictions at play here. And I think more than anything else, this underscores, again, to tie it back, I said apropos of nothing, but I think we can tie this back into the larger friend-enemy distinction that we've been discussing from the beginning, and that is to say that on the left, gays are considered an ally and an important part of homosexual identity traditionally is that it is not a choice. It is something that is innate, something that they cannot be talked out of through conversion therapy or anything else. But trannies, the transgender movement, is also perceived to be an ally, to be a friend, and it's very important for the alphabet people to be able to change what they are at any given time. And so the fact that there's absolutely no philosophical consistency here is not the issue. The issue is this is what the gays want, and they're our friends, so we're going to bless whatever it is that they say is important to them, and the transgender element is also our friend, so we are going to bless whatever it is that they say that they want, even if those two things are logically totally at odds and inconsistent. The important part is they're our friends, so we support them. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.